Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you've all joined the webinar. My name is Darren Marr. I head up the business development at PfH, and welcome to today's webinar with Procurement for Housing, hosted with Pay360 by Capita. We'll be giving you some insight into how you can achieve data security and compliance while still delivering a better customer experience. Pay360 are one of our key strategic suppliers on the PfH electronic payment services framework that offers a range of solutions to accommodate the ever-evolving payments market. Before we start, big thank you for attending and giving up your valuable time, very much appreciated. Just to let you know, the session will be recorded and you will each receive an email link to view it again following the event. Delighted to have two industry and sector specialists presenting: Wayne Campbell, who is Pay360's qualified PCI DSS internal security assessor and payment card industry professional, and John Greenwood, who heads up two roles: head of technology and PCI compliance at Contact Centre Panel and director at Compliance 3. Within the session, Wayne and John will provide insight into the changes that will come into play with PCI DSS v4, including the timescales you need to be aware of and the steps you can take to be prepared, maintain compliance and reduce the risk of fines. They'll have a discussion around compliance and data protection in a hybrid working environment. They will also run through some scenario-based strategies so you can see how you can process secure payments in a range of payment situations. And they'll also talk through how these strategies can be used to provide wider choice for both staff and customers and ultimately improve customer experience. There will be some time at the end to hopefully answer any questions you may have. If you can please use the Q&A chat function at the top of your screens, or it might be at the bottom. During the session, we'll try our best to come back and answer as many as possible within the allocated time. So over to Wayne and John.
Thank you so much, Darren. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity and time that everybody's given us today to share what we believe is a very, very important message at a very, very important time in the life cycle of both legislation and compliance within the payment industry as a whole, but obviously very applicable to housing associations, organizations who process personally identifiable information in credit and debit card data in a secure manner. And we're going to talk about what it really means to you based on the changes with the versions of PCI DSS and also the changes in industry and financial technology that's available to both your organizations but also your customers or your tenants, however you prefer to allude to them. They have a set of expectations now based on the things that we do in everyday life. Those expectations are driven mainly by the private sector and the digital engagement we have on a day-to-day basis with online platforms such as eBay and Amazon and Play. People's expectations and flexibility requirements have changed considerably over the last 5 years or so, and considerably increased, more so obviously over the last 2 years. So what I'm going to do is just go through a number of slides, and as I'm doing that, I'm going to just introduce first of all an industry colleague of mine, John Greenwood. A great guy in the industry, has helped the PCI DSS Security Standards Council with real in-depth knowledge-based information on his experience working within the call center environment internationally and within the UK, and how the effects of these compliance requirements have impacted those environments. So John, could you please just introduce yourself, and then what I'll do is come back to the slides and continue the messaging before. What we're going to do is have an open conversation about strategies and the way housing organizations can look forward to creating a business as usual environment.
No, that's great. Thanks for that, Wayne. I think very briefly, we've got a lot to cover, so I'll keep it brief. But my I guess my exposure to customer engagement started in the 80s, setting up a work from home team to arrange party plans. Then in the 90s, where I was involved in a company where we're helping international brands come to terms with the telephone as a customer engagement tool. Good example being Bill Gates and Microsoft, where we, as an outsourcer, organized the customer service for MSN when Bill Gates thought MSN was the internet. So we were building call centers, not just in the UK, multilingual, but through Europe, through Asia. And that was in the mid-90s, setting up call centers, running them for people. So, right up to more modern, setting up airlines, setting up direct banks, insurance companies, and just helping organizations come to terms with this multi-channel environment that's evolved over the last 30 years from voice and non-voice. So hopefully just sharing some of the impact on your customer experience, and then bringing, as Wayne was saying, these regulations and standards, contractual standards that are impacting on how we support our customers.
Thank you, John. Great introduction, as always. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is introduce myself. I'm Wayne Campbell. I am an ISA, Internal Qualified Assessor for PCI DSS. I represent Pay360. That's who you've let in the room and trusted with information today. It's a large organization who's been providing payment solutions within the housing and local government sector for over 30 years now. I've worked for them for 23 of those 30 years. We've created a group and a team that specifically targets and assists the housing sector with a specialist team, including an ex-CEO, an ex-director of social housing, and myself being a qualified security assessor. We pride ourselves on our evolving roadmap and investment in security and financial technology. But that's enough about us. That's who you've let in the room. What I want to focus on is what Pay360 has done historically, and then look at what's happening over the next year to two with PCI DSS and compliance and security requirements as a whole, and how we look at that as a bigger picture. So obviously, I'm not going to read through this entire screen. You can see for yourselves how long through investment we've been able to achieve PCI compliance and then maintain that throughout this timeline, launching a number of different services and products that support both the customer experience, but ensuring that compliance and legislation requirements were met throughout that time as well. So for today, what we're going to be doing is reviewing the PCI DSS version 4 timelines and changes to the environment. We've been working very, very closely with the PCI Security Standards Council because Pay360 are a participating organization. That means we work closely, as John does as well, with a number of special interest groups. John worked very closely with them on the guidelines written 2018, I believe, John.
Yeah. Well, we started in 2014.
Yeah.
When I started pestering the card brands to saying, look, Moto's exposed, we need to align it much more to our digital channels.
Moto meaning mail order telephone.
Mail order telephone. Well done, Wayne. Yeah, mail order telephone order. So the good old telephone. So yeah, working very closely, super excited to get involved, and it has benefits because we're given this inside track to share with our audience today.
Great stuff. So once we've gone through a review of PCI DSS version 4, the timelines and high-level changes that are going to be required within the standards, we're going to have an open conversation, myself and John, around compliance, data protection, specifically in a hybrid working environment. Housing organizations and organizations of all types across different markets have basically changed shape in the way they work, with a lot of people working from home, a lot of people working, half in the office, half at home. And when you look specifically at the documentation that was covered within telephone guidelines I think there was about 15 to 20 references to home working within there and securing that particular environment. So that will be an interesting discussion. We'll also from there lead on to strategies you as an organization can take using alternative approaches to meet those core regulatory requirements. And when I say regulatory requirements, although PCI DSS isn't law, it is referenced specifically within the Data Protection Act and on the ICO website as a guide for best practice for securing an environment that is processing credit and debit cards. And then we're going to look at the choices that can be offered by your organization to your customers, but also empowering your staff. What choices do they have when they're having an open human conversation, talking about someone who may be, vulnerable, they may be in a debt-based situation, and offering them a fixed, rigid way of paying and this payment plan and this payment mechanism only. It's something where you find using that approach, customers tend to look to, especially if they are in a vulnerable position, towards debt avoidance strategies and contact avoidance strategies, which is the last thing you want. So empowering your staff and giving them the tools to offer flexibility to customers is absolutely proven as a successful way of dealing with outstanding debt. So let's look at PCI DSS version 4 and the evolving security standards themselves and sort of validation and how you can validate. So we attended last year's PCI DSS Global Community Forum, and they gave us a core update as far as participating members and all of the QSA, Qualified Security Assessor and ISA community on the changes themselves, the timelines. Before they started, they said, right, okay, everyone calm down. The goals for PCI DSS, of which there are 4, the core has not changed. First and foremost, the Council's objective is to ensure the standard meets the security needs of the payment industry. And a core sort of word there that isn't included is the word compliance is not used. There is a real focus on continuity and security. So meeting those needs and continuing to meet those needs of the payment industry. Then secondly, the Council also through merchant and participating organization feedback, including Pay360, they wanted to add flexibility to support the different methodical approaches to achieve a secure infrastructure. And there's more on this that'll come to us as we go through the session today. They've also added ways to promote security as a continuing process, rather than a single point in time exercise where staff, your IT team, your data governance team are running around trying to ensure that everything's in place for that attestation of compliance or reporting your compliance through to your acquirer. It's a real focus on how you can achieve that using the standards, specifically PCI DSS goals 1, 3, 5, and 6. And they are regularly, it's easy for me to say, monitoring and testing networks, maintaining your information security policy, all the reference to maintaining elements of the standards, they'll have variation based on the changes between version 3.2.1 and version 4. And I'll come on to the timelines with version 4 in a moment. And finally, the Council, once again, through feedback and the RFC process, the RFC was request for changes that they put out to the PCI DSS participating organization community, to take this major release as an opportunity to enhance the validation methods and procedures, and more on that again as I go through the deck today. So before I begin, I want to make sure we're all on the same page, because I don't expect everybody on today's call to fully understand everything within the payment industry and how, card payments work. We all understand how it sort of works at a simple level. You wave your card at a contactless device and it either authorizes or declines, or you type your details in online. So what happens in the background, and where does PCI DSS come in within that? So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on this slide talking through the framework and structure of the card payment process and where PCI DSS assists within that process. So at the top of the tree, or the top of the pile, we've got card issuers, people that send you your card out in the post. They issue the cards, send them out to the card holders, your customers, yourselves, and those card holders will use those devices to make payments to merchants, third-party service providers such as yourselves, and other retail outlets. Those outlets will then transact payments through payment gateways. The provision of payment gateways can be directly through an acquirer or through services such as Pay360 provide. They then further transact securely that payment information through to the acquirer or the processor. Examples of those are WorldPay, Lloyds, Barclays, so on and so forth. And then a settlement decision is made. And you may have heard of this term, using strong customer authentication. So in the news over the past week or two, you may have seen issues with some payment service providers across the UK and Europe with the introduction of 3D Secure. You may be familiar with, or you may have heard of that term lately. So 3D Secure is 3-domain security. And what happens is lots of data, in addition to the card information, is now sent through to the acquirer and processor to make a decision on whether additional security information is required when a payment is made prior to a decision on authorization. And it's called 3D Secure because there are 3 domains. There is the card issuer domain. There is the interoperability domain, which is the payment gateway and the outlet. And then there is the acquirer domain. And between those 3 domains, they make the decision based on the data received as to whether that is a secure transaction or not. That data may include biometrics, it may include name and address, it may include geographic location as to where the payment is made, all trying to make that sort of at distance transaction more secure. And the guys that make the decision to authorize the payment are the card schemes. The card schemes manage the credit limits through the card issuers. So where do PCI come in? Sit at the edge, and they have an agreement directly with the card schemes to set a number of standards. A number of years ago, Visa, MasterCard, Diners, Amex all agreed, because they had their own separate security standards, to come together and create a Quango organization, PCI Security Standards Council, to manage, maintain, educate merchants, banks, card issuers, hardware suppliers on the security standards that are applicable to that whole payment ecosystem we've just looked at. What the card schemes do, because the PCI Security Standards Council have no enforcement regime, is based on the information received from the Standards Council and the acquirers and processors, they will enforce PCI DSS compliance through to the acquirers and processors and the card issuers. They also issue PCI penalties if there is a data breach or if there is an instance of what they see as non-compliance within a payment environment. And that's through contractual agreement between the card schemes and the acquirers and processors. The acquirers and processors, once again, through contractual agreement with the merchants, that's yourselves, will pass those fines and penalties on for any non-compliance environments or any data breaches. It is their job to enforce that compliance and educate merchants through payment gateways, education sessions, and information available directly from the PCI Security Standards Council. The acquirers and processors will report that compliance through to the card schemes themselves. The Standards Council, it's their job to provide training, certification, education through to merchants and the QSA and ISA community. And they do a good job of it. but their website is very large and there's a lot of documentation there, which is why it's due for review and re-release. They also provide PCI DSS audits on behalf of the card schemes if there is a data breach, and provide for forensic audit post-breach investigation reports through the QSAs and services that they provide. Right, that's out of the way, and hopefully we're all on the same page. I do apologize if you already knew all of that. If you did, absolutely great. If you didn't, hopefully it was enlightening, if not too boring. Okay, let's look at PCI DSS. So it started back in 2004. I'm sure John was probably involved then as well at some point, and it's had iterations throughout the last decade and beyond of different versions, mandated requirements within those versions based on technology changes and also knowledge within the payment industry, but importantly, feedback from merchants in multiple markets, including housing associations and local government. Throughout that time, and you'll see there's quite a big jump between sort of versions 3 to 3.2, 2013 to 2018, rather than a major release at that point, what the Security Standards Council started to do, which is enforced by the special interest groups that have run throughout the period, is provide supplemental guidance documentation to say you should be doing this with this technology or that with that technology, or here's a bit of clarity around these standards, so on and so forth, until we lead to PCI DSS version 4. And here's the big bang. The current version, the Ted Rogers version, I call it, version 3.2.1, has got 139 pages of information that needs to be digested, understood, and reported on as far as a merchant is concerned. And we'll come to how they do that in a moment using different self-assessment questionnaires. But PCI DSS version 4 has got 360 fun-packed pages of information giving you guidance on how compliance and security can be implemented and maintained. The documentation, the supporting documentation selectively from previous versions and from the supplemental guidance has now been added into the documentation itself. So at a high level on screen, I'm showing you PCI DSS version 3.2.1. There are 6 goals and there are 12 requirements listed below those 6 goals. So with the change to version 4, and if we watch the screen carefully, specifically the 6 goals, and then the one in the middle at the top, protect cardholder data, and any change to green is what's happening with version 4. So as you can see from that, 5 of the main goals haven't changed in the way they are described at a parent level, except for protect cardholder data. That's now changed to protect account data, and I'll give you some clarity on that and what that means. But as you can see below, every single one of the 12 requirements has changed in description. The outcomes, as far as securing the environment, will remain the same, but the descriptions are important with regards to that's changed. An important note to make is if, for example, you're reporting compliance by cross-referencing the standards and applying them in an IT security library to, say, Cyber Essentials or something like ISO 27003 or 1 or whichever, and you're referencing, for example, PCI requirement 12.8.2, those numbering conventions will now have changed. It will need to be relooked at because I think there are only 12 requirements across the entire original 329 that have remained the same. So let's look at these high-level changes and the reasons why they've done it and how it can help organizations. So we saw card data change to account data. The cardholder data only included the primary account number, the long pan on the card, cardholder name, date, and service code. Account data also includes the full track data on a card, the card verification code, and pins and pin blocks. And a pin and pin block is, for example, you know, when you receive a new card in the post and you receive a new pin, and then it's got that awful piece of plastic on you don't know how to take off with your pin number underneath. That's a pin and a pin block. So there are security requirements mandated around that data and how it's managed by card issuers, for example. So that wasn't covered, you know, amongst the original set of PCI standards. It is now. They've increased things. What they've done is given more descriptions and examples of how PCI DSS should be required and applied to an individual requirement. An example of that is one that's mandated around significant change. So significant change is a requirement that is applied to PCI DSS based on your submission of your attestation of compliance. So you either do it annually, send in your submission of compliance through an attestation form every year, or if there is a significant change to your environment, you do it then as well, which was great because, you know, we had different variations of people's opinions on based, you know, what's a significant change. And there's no significant change here. All we've done is changed our workstations and redeployed images pre-built on the PCs. What the descriptions and examples within the standards now do is give you clear indication as to what would be classed as a significant change. So that's why the document is considerably heftier than it ever has been historically. So that's Lauren Hall we've seen on screen, and she delivered the key update at the Global Security Standards Council's update last October at screen. And that's John Bluefield, another chap who assisted us with a number of special interest groups. The focus on sharing them is they gave us detail at a high level on the key subject matter of changes within PCI DSS. So password requirements are changing for payment applications, password complexity, password requirements on change, password encryption requirements are all increasing. And we all love longer, more complicated passwords, don't we? So no, I know that, but unfortunately there is an increase in the requirements on the complexity requirements based on technology change and computing power within PCs that are available to hackers. So, hacking a 12-digit password with one numeric and one uppercase character is pretty straightforward through a brute force attack. But if you change that to 15 characters with special characters, upper, lower, and numeric, it becomes considerably harder to get through that using that mechanism. So, and there's lots of other focus on key high-level security requirements. One real major emphasis and change is on the inclusion of service providers. And John, you may want to join in here. But scoping an environment doesn't end at your doorstep.
Oh, I think the whole subject of third-party service providers is the biggest headache I'm finding within the public sector now, and I think too in the private sector, because if you're asking somebody else to be involved in supporting the processing of payments or the taking of payments, enabling you to deliver your services, then that is an extension of your scope. And of course, we saw it in home working, right? Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, organizations have extended their cardholder data environments to the local residential community, right? Because you're taking payments at home. I mean, how crazy is that, right? When you think back, you think, well, hold on, I'd got some control over it whilst it was all in one building, access through the front door, video cameras checking people coming in. Well, I didn't see many video cameras stuck on folks' front door or entry passwords on the front doors or going up into their bedrooms to work, right? Different kettle of fish completely. So
you're absolutely right.
Let's just finish off your bit here, Wayne, and
yes, because we're going to have a chat later, about
into some strategy
and scope. Absolutely. So let me just quickly focus on how to report your compliance. So, how did the Security Standards Council, for a start, look at approaching compliance? It's always been historically very, very prescriptive. What they've done now is given you two options. One is the defined approach. That follows the traditional number of controls and requirements outlined within the standards, and what security officers are used to in reporting compliance. But what they've done is added a new customized approach to reporting compliance, which focuses on each individual objective, core objective for PCI DSS, and allows the organization to determine the controls used to meet that objective. So if you've already got a security and compliance strategy in place, you may now be able to just signpost that particular strategy or method to meet that requirement. Now, you can't mix and match, half defined, half customized. You've got to do one or the other. And I've found through discussion with QSAs and larger organizations that the customized approach is more apt, I would say, for organizations that have got a longer term, or let's say mature strategy on reporting compliance through different means. Compensating controls were going to be removed from the standards as a whole. And a compensating control is the ability to report non-compliance, but then basically give mitigation and reasons why, and other technology or operational processes in securing the environment. As I say, they were going to be removed, but they will be retained within version 4 through angry people's feedback. So that will remain. Let's have a look at the timelines for PCI DSS version 4. And we're just about there. We're not a long way away now. There's been 2 requests for changes through feedback through the community, 2019, 2020. In March, that's this month, this year, PCI DSS version 4 with the validation documents, if ready, will be released at the end of this month. We haven't heard anything different since the global and community update, or any frowns from anybody I know within the standards. So I believe that's still the case. Have you heard the same, John?
Yeah, I heard this. I was talking at an event with Jeremy earlier in the week and last week, and he's still confident that we should be seeing version 4 released before the end of the month next week. And the other news is that the validation documents will probably follow later.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So they'll probably be next year. Yeah.
ISA and training and supporting documents to support version 4 will not be available until after it's released. I think what it's going to do is give the merchant community time to digest the standards.
Absolutely.
Before we even try and train. So more importantly, I believe, not just the timeline for the release of version 4, is the timeline for transition. So you may be reporting compliance using the current version 3.2.1. Here is importantly, and please take note of this, it's, I think, super important based on your existing strategy and your existing timelines for reporting compliance. Look at this transition period and the requirements for the new version. So PCI DSS version 3.2.1 will be retired in Q1 2024. So that gives you a good sort of 24-month period to both plan and strategize for that date. So if at present you are submitting your compliance documentation in April, then great. If it's in September, look to realign those dates to match with both that retirement date, so you can submit version 4 in Q1, but also importantly, within the requirements, there are around about, I think it's about 30 controls that are classed as future dated requirements. And the effective date is Q1 2025 for those future dated requirements. One of them, for example, is MFA, or multi-factor authentication, which I believe is one of the future dated core requirements. So your payment application will send out, a secondary email or SMS to validate it's you logging on to the payment application. But if we look at that Q1 date 2025 and 2024, ideally for the 2023 submission, you want to realign your submission date for Q1. Otherwise, you're going to end up doing this twice in a single business year, which you wouldn't want to do because it's a it can be a big enough task. And preparing and planning for those dates and times will be well worth investing the time in realigning your submission plans. So quickly before we start, conversations, high level, the core requirements for PCI DSS or goals have not changed. What has changed, however, are the goalposts. So the detail within those goals. The 12 core requirements not expected to fundamentally change, but as we've reviewed, there are elements within there that have, and they've renumbered just about all of them. One of the major changes is the ability to use a customized approach, and that allows you to report your compliance in a way that you may be more comfortable in, but please, evaluate that internally with your teams when you get view of both approach documents with the release of PCI DSS version 4 at the end of this month. So it should be within the next week and a half or so. So John, this is where you shine, young man.
Hey.
So let's talk about the changing environment that's been not enforced upon organizations, but has been almost a change that was due based on the technology and working environments that were available and probably would have happened over the next 5 years anyway, based on home working environments. And we look, based on those first 3 bullet points at that sort of key triangle of industry and security, people, process, technology. How can an organization meet the core compliance and data protection requirements in a hybrid working environment, taking into account those 3 core high-level indicators?
Okay, so let's just keep this super simple, right? We know that our customer engagement environments, our contact centers have evolved over the years, and we know that it's always a people, process, and technology thing. We often just put technology first, but what we're trying to do here, and what the PCI DSS is specifically about, is protecting payment card data, right? But the best way for us to think of it, as you were saying, Wayne, is actually to think of it as the GDPR or Data Protection Act for card data, right? Simply because payment card data is personal data. Now then, the first people, if you have a data compromise, the first people who are going to knock on your door are the ICO. It's not going to be Jeremy King, right? And it's not going to be your bank, right? It's going to be the ICO. And that makes this whole card payment security thing actually a data governance issue. It's not an IT issue, right? It's certainly not a contact center issue. It's a data governance issue. And I think that's the lens through which we should view this whole piece, right? And of course, it's customer experience first. But when we were forced into this hybrid working scenario, what we've seen is people quite reluctant to get out of it. People quite like the flexibility. In America, they're calling it the Great Resignation because they can't get people back to work in a centralized environment. And look, for the last 30 years, right, we have not really, we've not increased wages at all. 60 to 70% of our costs is in people in a contact center environment. That's huge. And all the tech that we've used and a lot of the management that we have developed has been around managing cost, not necessarily about managing the result, right? And what that means is, well, actually, people quite like the reduction in cost of not having central buildings, right? Whether it's a large PLC or a small operating business, people like cost reduction. But the employee likes cost reduction too. The employee doesn't fancy getting on the bus for 40 minutes, right? Because there's an opportunity cost that somebody's got to look after the kids or mum and dad or something like that. So going back to work is a pain in the neck for a lot of people, right? Going back to work in the office. Now then, what the office, of course, gives us is much greater control of the people and the process,
Yeah.
Okay, cloud-based technology can facilitate us working from home, right, really easily without much complication, right? All you need is a piece of hardware and an internet connection, right? But this is the big but. Whether it's GDPR, Data Protection Act, or PCI DSS compliance, the entity, right, the housing associations have got to act reasonably. Their executive decisions have got to put them in a defendable position. And that defendable position is far harder to maintain, to establish and maintain in people's homes than it is centrally. And we know that what we've learned over the last couple of years is actually our energy levels, our motivation, and when we're using our voices, the way our voices come across is hugely influenced by our mood, by our well-being, by our state of mind. And it's bloody difficult to actually keep people energized when they're decentralized, working from home, than it is when we're in the center. And we can get that buzz and we can get that energy. And there are those corporate controls in place. So the hybrid working conversation is people-centric, right? Because people probably are a big security risk if you don't treat them right. So is technology, so is process, right? So, but we're a people business when we're serving our customers.
Yes.
We can let the machines do so much, but at the end of the day, housing associations like councils, we've got to look after our vulnerable customers. And we're probably judged by how well we do that, right? And we should continue to judge ourselves on how we do that, because it's the vulnerable customer test that actually is the acid test of any process and the people and the technology.
Yeah, you're right. And everything we've just referenced there, when we look at compliance, signposts directly back to scope of environment, scope of environment, applicable to people and the process and the technology. You think about that journey of the card data at its ingress or its point of entry, how it gets its way through to that authorization process and back, passing through people's home telephones, possibly mobile phones. You got to think about their environment, the person, the home router. The whole thing has to be taken into account.
You're so right. Look, when we set about reviewing the 2011 guidance on telephone payments, protecting telephone-based card holder data, right? We had to consider this change to VoIP, right? Look, the whole process of engaging with a customer doesn't happen down copper lines and tin boxes anymore, right? It's through VoIP, it's through cloud-based infrastructure. That makes it look like the internet. So we had to, because with the internet, it's only the high street and the back street going to the cloud, right? And contact centers have gone the same route. And then so the emphasis that we used, that I particularly used to cajole the card brands and the PCI Council into rewriting the guidance on telephone payments, was to make sure people understood that spoken cardholder data was cardholder data. It needed to be secured. It wasn't, the call recording, which is where Pause Resume came from, and a load of tech companies made a load of dollars and still do.
Yeah, the whole mishmash of call recording, yes.
Yeah, because, they're selling licenses for it and they get paid a good dollar for maintaining those licenses. Yeah. All it does is take your call recordings and the call recording storage out of scope. Yep. Everything else is still in scope, right? So you've now got the local, all those local homes in scope, and your task as a merchant is to make sure it's secure.
It is, completely. And I'm going to have to move things along, John. So I'm going to pop to the next slide. Let's talk about scenario-based PCI strategies. Looking at different channels and technologies that can be applied to a payment processing environment that will both secure and look to de-scope an environment.
Let's keep that quite punchy, right? There's a smart way of doing this, and there's a not smart way of doing it. The not smart way is to apply all of the PCI DSS to all of your environment all of the time, right? That's heavy, heavy overhead, right? It's a lot, you can lose sleep over that, right? The smart way is to do two things, First of all, attest your compliance on a payment acceptance channel by payment acceptance channel basis. That means deal with your face-to-face separate from your e-com, separate from your mail order, telephone order, right? Now,
Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer. It breaks it down. It means that you can certify compliance for the easy stuff first.
Yep.
The easy stuff, number one, face-to-face, just migrate everything to P2PE. Get it off your network, right? Keep it secure, encrypt it, deal with it, get a migration plan to swap out all of your old kit that put card data over your network, bringing your entire network and connected systems into scope, go P2PE.
So P2PE, just for everybody's benefit, is point-to-point encryption, and that's a technology of encryption that is applied to chip and pin devices that are either, handheld or attached to a kiosk device. That encryption level allows you to reduce risk and scope based on assumptions as it's certified. So instead of 329 controls applied, you've only got 33. So it removes nearly 300 controls based on that one technology.
And it should just work, right? You should just get it and it works, right? That's, if it's fit for purpose and it's certified, tick, job done. The next thing we should look at is e-com, right? This is where most of the fraud is. That's super, super simple, right? You use web redirection, you use a third party to process it, and you use, if you are using an iframe, use super simple one and don't get fancy pulling in data from everywhere, because if you can pull it in from somewhere, that you'll pull in a criminal with it.
Yep.
British Airways, need I say more, right? So that's super simple, SAQA, right? Dead simple. Mail order, telephone order, right? This is the biggie, because we've got to look after our vulnerable customers. So first of all, let's identify what calls we're getting down the pipe. If it's vulnerable customers, let's understand what proportion of those calls are coming through vulnerable customers who can't use technology, but we've got an obligation to serve them, right? Now, working with the banks, they've been super, super helpful with the acquiring banks, so we can standardize what dealing with vulnerable customers look like who can't use technology. Once we've got that one out of the way, we have to align our technology play here, our compliance strategy, with how we want to interact with our customers. And there are customers out there, generally under 30, who don't talk. They use their thumbs. They're digital. Even old-timers like me are getting digital, right? Just do it. It's done, right? I don't need anybody to give me a hug and give me a welcome, right? It costs you more money as a merchant, and I don't need the time or the grief. Just let me do it digitally, right? And whether it's using my banking app or using just clicking in and putting my card number into a link, super duper, right? Do I necessarily want to be speaking to the agent all the time? Well, maybe sometimes. Maybe when it's that type of call that I need that arm round, that help, that I need that, speaking constantly with the customer, using technology to enable that one-to-one conversation to continue.
Yeah.
But it's customer experience led. That's the point. It's customer experience led.
It is, and I think that's key to looking at how you giving your staff the tools that empower them to empower them so they can have that conversation.
Absolutely, and every organization will look at this differently, and that's the point. When we wrote the guidance, we put customer experience first and enabled organizations to take that arm round approach, a tended approach, or an unattended approach where actually it automates, like an IVR or buying a cinema ticket or something. But we also highlighted that there are telephony dependent technologies, but also digital technologies, far easier to deploy, far more straightforward, more aligned to different part of the community.
Simple to secure as well, because it is a redirect. You are redirecting to a pre-proven secure environment.
Pre-proven, and from the beginning of last week, right, the 14th of March, strong customer authentication, which you mentioned.
Yes. Liability shift completely.
Liability shift. You get rid of those chargebacks. because you've turned what is an unsecure mail order telephone transaction into a secure e-commerce transaction with strong customer authentication.
Yes. That leads us on nicely to that subject of choices for customer and staff, and
Absolutely.
looking not to limit both the customer and the member of staff with traditional methods of processing income. Now, we all know that the halo of direct debit is perfection, because it's not guaranteed income, but it is.
It feels more secure, right?
Based on that simplicity, it feels more secure, certainly for the receiving organization, the merchant as such.
You've got it. Now then, I did some work with the UN last year for one of their global charities, and we were looking at their PCI compliance and their strategy for that. And do you know what? Because they're global and they have different campaigns as different parts of the world suffer and have problems with feeding and many people, et cetera, the big change in the strategy was that we had to align taking donations with how people paid locally. And we all pay differently in different countries, right? Cards are not number one in this country, right? Wallets are, right? But it's no good offering a wallet that nobody uses, right? You've got to align your payment strategy with how people want to pay. Now then, direct debit's great, but there are a lot of people now use banking apps. And there are technologies out there, right, that will enable you to service a direct debit, less friction to the customer, less time, cost, and effort in the contact center, right? So everyone's a winner, where you can use the banking app to complete a direct debit.
Yes.
What's not to like,
no,
right?
Exactly.
What's not to like? The customer wins, the contact center ends, and they can tick a big box on cost reduction.
Yeah. So, I mean, technology is changing, and the people's profile of use of technology is changing, which really comes on to what's a final bit of a message, which is the detail given to us. And this is very high level. So please, within the audience, go off and find this yourself, the Ofcom Nation report and information through from UK Finance based on that digital change. So when we look at inclusion and accessibility, make sure we're not looking in one direction only. Such as myself, the Silver Surfers in one direction, and then in the other direction is my daughter and her friends and other sort of youthful people that know and prefer to use that way of transacting and communicating with organizations. And the uptake is increased based on that demographic and that age group, and it's proven based on the data provided by both UK Finance, but really detailed in the Ofcom Online Nation report.
Yeah, it's a good report to look at, because this is Ofcom, this is our communications regulator, and they're basically telling us that, yeah, sure, there's a consistent 13–14% of the population that are not digitally connected, and of course we've got to look after them. There's contractual advice to look after them, but that's sort of 85–86% that are digitally connected, right? And actually our contact strategies should move perhaps quicker to reflect that, certainly in the way we're taking payments and reducing the friction in the process, putting the customer first.
It is. Superb. Wary of time, John, and thank you very much. I'm just going to leave our contact details on screen if anybody wants to reach out, but I'm going to hand now back to Darren just to wrap, see if there's anything that's come through in the Q&A. If anybody's got any questions, we're quite happy to try to address them if we can.
Yeah, thanks Wayne. Thanks John. Some great detail there and lots of great guidance. Thank you. There's no actual questions that have come through the chat. I don't know if anybody's like to send any through now if they've got them. Just a quick one for me, I suppose. Why is all this important to us, and probably more importantly, why now?
Yeah, good question, Darren. I don't know whether anybody's noticed what's happening in the middle of Europe there, but the banks are telling us that cybercrime's nearly doubled. The instances of cybercrime, particularly in call centers, has doubled. Why? because of sanctions, and cybercrime's increasing because of people need cash, and if they can steal it, well, that's fine, right? Why now? Data protection is the law. We're supposed to protect data by design and default. Doing payments in people's homes, I can't see how that's secure by design and default. I'm not sure that can be argued as a defendable position. So why now? Well, the world's getting less secure, and look at the PCI DSS, it's playing catch up. It always has. Started off at 17 pages, now we're at 360, because all they want to do is help you understand why you should do it, what you've got to do now, and what you've got to continue to do to turn this into a business as usual activity.
Great, thank you. We do have a question that's come through. Thanks, David. Within an organisation, who should be taking responsibility for this? IT teams?
Definitely not. I have not seen one in all the years I've done, and over 60 projects that I've supported, I have not seen one led by IT that's been successful. Not because they can't do it, it's because they're too busy, right? This should be led by data governance.
Yes.
And it should be backed up by Treasury and Finance, because they've got the relationship with the bank. And at the end of the day, this is a contractual obligation between the bank and the merchant. Wow. What are your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely agree. I mean, I usually drive it towards a DPO, data protection officer, if I can, to have the initial conversation, give the DPO the tools to have a chat with someone upstairs to get them on board, and then try and create a PCI DSS working group. And that's representatives from every department that would be impacted by the scope of the card data environment, which includes IT, customer services, the whole sort of organization, an individual representative that has a case to be involved. It's not something that can be managed by any one individual or an individual department.
On top of that, I'd only add, Wayne, that we can see with version 4 that we're moving more towards ISO.
Yes.
Right. The card brands, they don't want to be the bad guy when the data regulators are picking up, the impact of security, regulating security, because card data is personal data. It's just more attractive personal data to criminals because they can monetize it easier. And if you've got cardholder data in your environment, you're leaving cash on the street. You're leaving cash on the street. It's
one of the main clarification questions I get in sessions, based on a statement of someone that may work in IT, may work in the finance department, is that's fine. We don't store card details within our environment. But the thing is, the scope of environment is applicable to not only storage, but processing and transmission. So if your environment either processes or transmits card data, it doesn't matter whether you store or save that information, it's fully in scope and fully available to someone being able to hack that environment.
Yeah.
Which is why that's a core element that needs to be taken into account.
And one final thing to add that version 4 does in spades is make it clear that the standard also now covers entities that can influence the security of the card data, which means that if it's an entity that doesn't store, process, or transmit, but directs it to a fourth party, well, it could be one for me, one for you. They could be copying the data and sending it to their mates.
But is that connected to environment that suddenly becomes...
Absolutely. So it's influencing the security as well as store, process, and transmit.
Yeah.
Thanks, Wayne. John, I think we're just coming to the end. We've got 30 seconds left, so if there's no more questions that have come through. So that kind of concludes the webinar. Thanks everybody for joining. We found it a useful session. Just to recap, you will get an email with the link to the recording and any answers to any of the questions, and we'll give you some contact details for both Pay360 by Capita and PfH if you'd like to discuss anything further following the webinar. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.